Rabbi Daniel gave us a talk about the statistical improbability of Jews existing today, how unbelievable it is that we've managed to survive all of these things and yet we're still here, etc., etc., etc. And I was studying econometrics statistics at the time, and I was like, that sounds quite interesting. Let me try and put some numbers on that. So I spent the next 6 months of my life gathering data to try and build a multivariate linear regressional model. And for those of you who aren't that familiar with statistics, I mean, this is a very basic technique in statistics to try and understand the different variables that impact a specific outcome. So if you want to understand why are you happy on a given day, you might measure the last 1,000 days and check whether you're happy or not, and see which factors are statistically significant. So you might measure, the weather, you might measure how much sleep you had, you might measure the relationship with your families, and come to the conclusion that actually, if it's sunny, that had a positive impact. If it was a weekend, that also had a positive impact. If I had a good relationship with my parents, that also had a positive impact. But it might be that, if my dog barked loudly, that actually had no impact, or whatever it is. And so you can see from, trial and error, a bunch of different variables, and see, how statistically significant they are on a given outcome. So if you want to understand what are the variables, the socioeconomic variables, which are statistically significant in determining whether a nation does or doesn't survive, you can, from the data that I gather, you can probably, from let's say the last 3,500 years, you've got around 3,000 nations. And now to define a nation is very difficult, and I don't want to go into that now. But there are roughly, 8-9 variables which are incredibly statistically significant. So much so that of all the nations that survive, these variables explain the existence of each one of these nations with an accuracy of around 85-90%. Now, they are how geographically big a nation is, how numerous a nation is, how remote a nation is, whether its population has ever decreased by 30% or more, whether it's ever been in exile, the inverse of how long it's been around, whether it's ever been enslaved, etc. And these variables really do dictate whether a nation does or doesn't survive. And it works for every single nation that currently exists, with one massive, massive exception. And these variables, these macroeconomic variables, which pretty much govern the state of the world, explain the existence of the Jews with around, an accuracy of around 14-15%. So if you take them in order, they've never been geographically big. They have never been numerous. They've never been remote. They've been around for as long as anybody. Their population has decreased by 30% or more 4 times. No other nation has survived more than once. They've been in exile 80 plus times. No other nation has survived more than one exile. They've been enslaved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you realize that when you sort of put the numbers to it, they are a massive statistical anomaly. And you don't really need the numbers to see that. If you look throughout history, the things that we've actually been through and still survived, it's absolutely abnormal.
Also spread across the country, in every single country they have the same Shabbat.
It's just absolutely absurd. And so what you then have to do, and so this is sort of where the mathematical rigor ends. But what you then have to, you need to now come up with a variable, come up with a factor, which is the explanatory variable, which explains the existence of the Jews, but crucially isn't needed to explain the existence of any other nation. Otherwise, there would be a gap in the explanatory variables of every other nation. Which means you need to come up with a factor which explains, which is unique to the Jews. And so my conclusion was, at the age of 21, 22, was that the book they're following, the text they're following, must be fundamentally correct. That is the reason why they are capable of beating the statistics. And so then I decided to become frum.